The Cold War by Anish Gogolani, Oxayan Sivasekaran, and Ryan Johnson. You're probably wondering, what was the Cold War? The Cold War was an ideological conflict between communist countries and capitalist countries.
Capitalism is a type of social economy that is based off individual rights and freedom.
Communism is a type of social economy that is ruled by a single power, which is usually the government.
The Cold War started in World War II when the Allies won and the Soviet Union wanted the leftover countries communist, while the US wanted them capitalist.
Since all countries couldn't be capitalist and communist at the same time, the Allies divided all leftover countries into capitalist and communist. They divided Europe. The Soviet Union built the Berlin Wall to separate Germany into East and West Germany, and they owned East Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe, while the other capitalist countries owned West Germany and the west part of Europe. They did this because they did not want people escaping from East Germany to West Germany.
The Truman Doctrine allowed the U.S. to provide military power and funds for countries in need and under threat from communist countries.
Because of the Truman Doctrine, we, America, were allowed to provide Greece and Turkey with about a combined $400 million of military and funds to help them beat communist countries in war.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was when the Soviet Union built missiles on Cuba to bomb the U.S. Then John F. Kennedy agreed that if the Soviet Union removed the missiles, the U.S. wouldn't attack Cuba.
The Korean War was one of the greatest wars in all of Cold War history. The Korean War was the first war that the UN participated in. It started on June 25, 1950, and ended July 27, 1953. Before we talk about the Korean War, we should discuss the UN. The UN, also known as the United Nations, is an organization formed by the Allies after World War II to keep peace in the world. It was also made to prevent any wars like World War II from happening again. That would be catastrophic.
The Korean War started when North Korean troops, also known as the Reds, invaded South Korea so they could unite and become communist under the Soviet control. The UN provided 90% of military supplies to South Korea and asked member countries to help. Essentially, the UN was the backbone of South Korea's military.
After 3 bloody years of fighting, North Korea and South Korea decided to sign a peace treaty where the two countries would be separated by the 38th parallel.
At the end of the Korean War, about 560,000 UN troops were killed and 1.6 million communist troops killed.
In 1954, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the United States, and 4 other nations formed the Southeast Asia Trade Organization called SEATO. SEATO was formed to stop communist expansion in Southeast Asia. This was a big thing for capitalists.
In 1955 and 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the USSR, and Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, signed a treaty where there is no more war and only technological and economical competition. This was called the Spirit of Geneva.
In 1956, capitalist Israel invaded a communist Egypt with the help of Great Britain and France. This sparked tensions between capitalist and communist countries, but the truce was still there and US and Soviet Union had no tensions. Because the Soviet Union backed up Egypt, the Soviet Union became allies with most Arab countries.
This treaty prompted the space race to begin. The Soviet Union first launched Sputnik 1, the first satellite, into space in 1957. The U.S. launched Explorer 1, its first satellite, into space in 1958. The Soviets sent the first probe to hit the moon in 1959. In 1961, the Soviets sent Yuri Gagarin as first person in space, while Alan Shepard became the first American in space. After a long process, in July 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins became the first people on the moon.
In 1961, when Cuba was led by Fidel Castro, Fidel Castro began to receive help from communist countries, especially the USSR. This led Cuba to seize millions of dollars from America and American property and other illegal stuff. This prompted Cuban exiles working for the U.S. to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. This attack is famously known as the Bay of Pigs, and it was meant to be a coup to overthrow Fidel Castro but failed, and this damaged America's reputation badly.
The Vietnam War was a very memorable and important part of the Cold War. The Vietnam War lasted from 1957 to 1975. This was the longest war the U.S. participated in. But the Vietnam War was actually the second phase of conflict in Vietnam. It all started when the Vietnamese fought France for independence in 1946.
The U.S. sent France military equipment to help with the war, but Vietnam still defeated France with the help of communist countries in 1954. Then Vietnam was split into North and South Vietnam, and South Vietnam was non-communist and in the UN. Because of the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. helped South Vietnam, which was challenged by communist countries.
North Vietnam, also known as Viet Cong, wanted to unite North and South Vietnam so that the U.S. couldn't control any of Vietnam. North Vietnam was supplied with military equipment by many communist countries so that they could win the war. Because of this, the UN countries helped South Vietnam. This was because they feared if one South Asian country became communist, all of them would. Gradually, the UN withdrew its troops from Vietnam until a ceasefire in 1973. In the end, there were 1.3 million casualties. Later, North Vietnam helped fight the U.S. in Cambodia and later reunited all of Vietnam.
After the space race, the U.S., the U.K., and the USSR formed a treaty so that they would stop fighting. This lasted until the 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev and his Soviet Union interfered with the Afghanistan war. At this time, communism was becoming less popular until the Soviet Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union in 1991. After all of this fighting, the end of the Cold War has come. The communists have lost, and the capitalists have won.